Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the January 2018 DIBBLE webinar on the success sequence, marriage, kids, and success among millennials. Topic I'm sure we're all interested in knowing about. So let me give you some, this is Kay Reed, I'm the Executive Director of the DIBBLE Institute, and I'd like to introduce you to Kathy Guidry, who is our engineer. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, it's good to be with you all today.
Great. So I'll introduce Brad in just a moment. If you can't get the audio through your computer, here's the phone number and the call-in code.
Muted.
And please type your questions into the question box. We'll be answering those at the end of our session. We have included about 4 poll questions, and we may have some raise your hands questions. At the end of this, everything meaning the recording, the slides, and Brad's report will be available on our archive. So let me just go over a little bit about the DIBBLE Institute. How many of you, actually, let me do a hand raise. How many of you know the DIBBLE Institute? How many of you either use our programs or have been on a webinar with us before? Okay, I see those hands going up. Okay, so it's about a quarter of you. So we welcome you back, and we also especially welcome those people who are new to the DIBBLE Institute. So let me give you some background. These are Charlie and Helen DIBBLE. They are our founders. Charlie was an engineer by trade, but when he retired, he started doing lots of youth work. And in his youth work as a volunteer, he would notice a couple of things. He would notice how his young friends how their trajectories in life would change if their parents' marriages or relationships foundered. And he also noted how many of his young friends were just not confident that they could have a long-lasting, successful marriage and family life. And so he, being an engineering type, decided he could work on this. So now some 20 years later, Kathy, the next slide, some 20 years later, we have the DIBBLE Institute. Charlie's vision was to translate research into teaching tools that then we make widely available to people around the country. And last year, I'm pleased to say, our programs were taught in 44 states, and we believe a conservative estimate of the number of youth reached are over 76,000. So for those of you who are on the call who have used our materials, you are part of the team, and we are so grateful for your work. So the DIBBLE Institute is a national independent nonprofit, and we have some core values. One is we believe in the power of research. That's why we have people like Dr. Wilcox with us today. We use research to guide our programs. We get our programs evaluated so we understand what they do and how we can improve them. And that also means that when the research shifts, we will update our materials to make sure they stay current with current research. We are big fans of stable and healthy families. And that said, we also understand that every day there are countless single parents who are putting one foot in front of the other and doing amazing jobs of raising their kids. So while we're big fans of couples raising children, preferably married couples raising children, we by no means, by that statement, mean to disrespect the hard work that countless single parents are doing every day. But when you would ask them, many of them would say that they wish it were different, that they had made different choices, that it's hard to raise kids on your own. It's hard financially, it's hard socially, it's hard physically, it's hard every single way. The second thing about this is we just should not tolerate high conflict or conflict in relationships that can't be managed, especially high conflict relationships. So where people are abusive of self or others or substances, those relationships should go away. It's better for kids. But we do also know that many couples split up when they have kind of low-level conflicts that don't impact the children, but maybe they aren't happy. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that, again, by putting one foot in front of the other and doing maybe or maybe not some interventions with various kinds of marriage enrichment programs, those marriages can be turned around, because it's really devastating for children, and that's why I'm in this work, to have all of a sudden come home one day and one of your parents is not there, and it just complicates life and makes it really difficult for young people. So the next slide, Kathy. We also believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect, and all relationships can be made better through relationship skills. So we intentionally write our programs so that they can apply to many different audiences, many different kinds of relationships, because we know that all relationships can use skills to get better. So let's move on to the next slide. So today I want to introduce Brad Wilcox. He's the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He's a professor of sociology there as well, and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. His research is focused on marriage, fatherhood, and cohabitation, especially on the ways that family structure, civil society, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the United States. And for today, he's going to be talking about a recent report he wrote on the success sequence and the millennial population. So welcome, Brad. Thanks for coming.
Kay, it's great to be here today. And so I'm talking today again about the success sequence, and I'm speaking more specifically about a report. Can we have the next slide, Kathy? That Wendy Wang from the Institute for Family Studies and I authored this past year, called the Millennial Success Sequence, subtitled Marriage, Kids, and the Success Sequence Among Young Adults. Next slide, Kathy, please. As we talk about and think about millennials and think about their progression towards adulthood, I think everyone recognizes that they're taking often different paths into adulthood, often divergent paths into adulthood. And given the kind of increasing complexity that we're seeing in young adult paths into adulthood, I think the logical question, or an obvious question, is how are these different paths related to their financial success, to their financial security and stability, and to poverty? And as Wendy and I were thinking about that question, we were really wondering if Ron Haskins and Bell Sawhill's formulation of the success sequence was still applicable to millennials. And in particular, how much did marriage matter for today's millennials? And as we were thinking about that question, we also wanted to sort of look at this issue of how marriage might matter for communities and for states. So on that first question, let's turn to the next slide. When it comes to sort of looking at the paths that millennials are taking into young adulthood, what we see is that they are much more likely to be putting the baby first, or to be unmarried and childless, compared to baby boomers at a similar age back in the late 50s and early 1960s. There's obviously been a big shift from the boomers to this generation. And then the obvious question then, the next slide please, Kathy, is does the success sequence still work? And again, this is Ron Haskins and Bell Sawhill's idea, and what they argued is that getting at least a high school degree, working full-time in your 20s, and marrying before having any children were linked to being more financially successful and more likely to avoid poverty for young adults. And they were working with an older data set, and we wanted to see if this formulation, this idea, was still applicable to millennials. Next slide, please. And what we found in a report for the Institute for Family Studies and for the American Enterprise Institute this past year in 2017 was that yes, millennials who followed this sequence, who graduated from high school and then had full-time work, and then got married before having any kids, were much less likely to be poor compared to their peers who did not follow these 3 steps. And this figure here in front of you illustrates kind of the association between following each of the steps and the likelihood that millennials in their late 20s and early 30s are poor. Next slide. Now, in talking though, of course, about the success sequence, I think an obvious question is whether it's the sequence itself that matters, or whether it's larger social structures kind of affecting adult lives that are really determining the kinds of patterns that we're seeing in the data. So, of course, it could be the case that young adults who grow up in better neighborhoods, who have access to good schools, were raised by highly educated parents, and had more income growing up, are better able to navigate education, better able to find a decent paying job, and better able to forge a stable marriage for themselves. And that by contrast, young adults who've been raised in poor neighborhoods, been educated by bad schools, and raised in lower income, often more unstable families, are going to be more likely to flounder when it comes to school, when it comes to work, and when it comes to their adult relationships, including marriage. So the question, right, is whether or not the success sequence matters as much for kids from less affluent backgrounds, less privileged backgrounds, whether also it's more common. The sequence is more common among young adults from more privileged backgrounds. And so as we think about that question, let's go to the next slide. It's important to acknowledge that this sequence is indeed more likely to be followed by younger adults from higher income families. So if you break them out into thirds, you can see that about 65% of young adults from more affluent families are following the sequence or on track with the sequence, compared to just 31% of younger adults from lower income families. So I think both Wendy Wong and I would acknowledge that part of the story here is that younger adults who are, exposed to more advantaged families, better neighborhoods, better schools, are more likely to be themselves, flourishing, more likely to excel in school, excel in work, and excel in family life because they've been exposed to models and given resources that that give them a leg up in life in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. So as we think though about kind of whether or not the sequence matters for adults from a range of different backgrounds, so I want to actually go to question number 2 here, Kathy. And if you can just answer yes or no for this question, that is, do you think the success sequence works for minorities and for millennials from lower income families? Just select one of the following answers as we go forward here.
Okay, we're starting to get some. Kathy's going to put it out on the screen. Oop. Yeah.
Okay, so what we can see here is that a majority of the people who are on this particular webinar think this success sequence works also for minorities and for millennials from lower income families. And if we can go back to the next slide in my deck, what we can see in that is that indeed it is the case that millennials, sorry, next slide again, Kathy, from lower income families are more likely to be flourishing financially and more likely to avoid poverty if they are following all 3 steps. So we can see here in this slide, slide 19, as it's labeled on the deck, are much less likely to be poor if they're following all 3 steps, or if they're on track because they haven't had a child before outside of marriage, compared to their peers who are missing 1 or 2 steps, or all 3 of the steps. So again, what this figure is telling us is that young adults from lower income backgrounds are only about 1/3 as likely to be poor compared to those peers who've missed 1 or 2 steps, and are much, much less likely to be poor compared to their peers who've missed all 3 steps. So this suggests, of course, it doesn't prove that following the sequence is probably beneficial, not just for young adults from middle income and upper income families, but also for younger adults from lower income families. Next slide, please. And then we see a similar story for African Americans and for Hispanics in slide 20. We can see that African Americans and Hispanics who have followed all 3 steps or are on track with the sequence are much less likely to be poor compared to their peers, their fellow African Americans and fellow Hispanics who have missed 1 or 2 of the steps or all 3 of the steps. And this kind of association is obviously particularly salient for African Americans. So their odds of ending up in poverty are much, much lower compared to other African Americans if they have indeed followed the sequence of getting at least a high school degree, working full-time in the 20s, and marrying before having any children. Next slide, please, Kathy. Now, in talking about the success sequence and thinking about the success sequence, I think it certainly is the case that arguing in public that education matters for people's financial well-being, or arguing in public that work matters for people's financial well-being are not particularly controversial claims. I think most people across the ideological spectrum would acknowledge that education and work are integral to Americans' financial well-being. So those, in a sense, first 2 steps in the sequence are not particularly controversial steps to mention. But when you then add that getting married before having any children is also important for people financially, that is more controversial in some circles. Next slide, please. And probably one of the most, I think, engaging and articulate critics of the success sequence is Matt Bruenig, who is, as probably many of you know, a prominent blogger on issues related to poverty and the welfare state and economics more generally. And he has argued in his analysis of different data that, quote, full-time work is responsible for the low poverty results of the various success sequences, unquote. And his basic argument is that if you look at people who are working full-time, their odds of being poor are quite low, and their odds of doing relatively well financially, being sort of middle class, upper class, are much higher. So really, he would contend that what I've been talking about really is about work and patterns of work, and not really about education per se, or about certainly marriage per se. So I wanted to kind of look, in light of that criticism, at sort of the specific role of marriage in all this. So next slide, please. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So when you look at this just kind of in a bivariate context, and you look at sort of how people are sequencing marriage and childbearing, or if they're experiencing marriage, what you can see here is that, again, just looking here at poverty-free millennials and looking at their sort of family trajectories, we can see that those who marry first are much less likely to be poor than those who are unmarried and childless, and especially those who have a child before marrying. But of course, the question here is, in part, is it really marriage driving this, or is it the fact that people who are more educated, more affluent, are pursuing marriage? It's really their education, and it's a work that's accounting for this pattern. Next slide, please. And so, in wanting to kind of a more sustained look at this question, we did 2 sets of multivariate regressions. One looking at the outcome of being in the middle or upper income categories for our millennial sample, and the second being poor for our millennial sample. And so we're looking here at the unique association between family formation and income and information and poverty after controlling for work status, education, race, ethnicity, The AFQT score, which is kind of a measure of intelligence, and people's family income growing up. And what you can see in this slide is that even after controlling for work status in your 20s, even after controlling for education, race, ethnicity, your AFQT score, and your family income growing up, that people who married first before having any kids were much more likely to be in that middle or upper income category compared to their peers who had had a baby first. And people who had married first were about 60% less likely to be poor compared to their peers who had put the baby first. And so, in light of these particular regressions, we would suggest that Brunig really is not correct because work doesn't do all the work here in these regressions. Neither obviously does education. There's still kind of a unique association between family formation here and our outcomes in terms of poverty, outcomes in terms of being in the middle or upper end of the income distribution for these millennials in this table. Next slide, please. So what is it about these 3 steps that matters for young adults, even today? And when it comes to education, I think we would all kind of, again, acknowledge that education can supply skills, can embed you in social networks that can help you find good work or better work, and also hopefully imparts knowledge that gives you the ability to excel in a particular profession. So in these ways, among others, education is linked to to your income over time. When it comes to work, obviously, having full-time work leads to greater income, but also can lead to a certain kind of discipline in your life that matters in a variety of ways, and then also can give you more opportunities for finding even better work down the road. And then when it comes to marriage, marriage we think matters I think marriage matters because number one, it supplies economies of scale. Number two, you're often pooling income today with both spouses working. But a third point too is that marriage is more stable. And so people who get married are less likely to incur the costs of family instability. Things, for instance, like child support or raising a child on your own as a single parent. So this brings us to the next slide. And you can see here that in America today, that couples who have their first child in a cohabiting union are about 3 times more likely to break up by the time that child turns 5 compared to couples who have their first child in marriage. Or another way to put this is sort of putting marriage before the baby carriage is linked to stability, whereas putting the baby carriage before marriage is linked to much more instability. And again, because family instability is expensive in terms of things like child support, oftentimes legal costs, or the cost obviously being a single parent, this is, I think, kind of the fundamental reason why someone like Matt Brunig is really not correct. Because what he's really not thinking about is the way in which the sequencing of marriage and parenthood, or the existence of marriage in the first place, is integrally related to family stability, which in and of itself has a very strong impact on families' economic well-being, above and beyond people's work status. Next slide, please. So when it comes to families and economics, and I think the idea here is that work doesn't do all the work. And that couples who have their kids in marriage are more likely, I'm not saying they're always obviously going to stay together, but they're more likely to remain together and therefore avoid incurring major costs that we see associated today with family breakdown and with family instability in the United States. So again, the point here is that all 3 steps of the success sequence, education, work, and marriage have an impact on families' economic well-being and millennials' well-being, economically speaking, even today in the early part of the 21st century. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've kind of made the argument that the success sequence, an idea that Ron Haskins and Bell Sihel talked about back in 2009 in a big book and then in many different articles, is still applicable today in 2017, still applicable for millennials, and that marriage in particular matters for the welfare of young adults and for their children. But we've kind of been talking about sort of households and individuals. And I want to now, as we kind of move towards the conclusion of this presentation, to think about kind of how family structure, how marriage might matter for the economic well-being of communities and states more generally. And before we go into this section, I want to go to the last question that I'd given to you, Kathy, about cities and economic mobility. So just kind of think again about kind of the ecological story here, about what's happening in communities and cities and states across the country. I want to ask this question. In which city do you think is income mobility for poor children highest? That is, where is the American dream the strongest? So I'm thinking here about which city will a child who's growing up poor have the greatest chance of reaching the upper quintile, the top 20% of American income as an adult. And I am relying here and posing this question. I worked at Raj Chetty, an economist who was at Harvard and now is at Stanford, has done. So as you answer this question, it was Boston, San Francisco, Atlanta, or Salt Lake City. And the correct response is the modal response here. That is, Salt Lake City is the city, and looking at sort of larger cities in America, where poor kids are most likely to realize the American dream. Let's go back to the slides here now, Kathy. I'm gonna go back, yeah. So we can see this kind of illustrated in the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide here. The scatter plot is actually taken from Raj Chetty and from his colleagues at Harvard, Stanford, and Berkeley. But what Chetty found was that the odds that kids who were born in a single parent, the odds that kids were born poor were much higher of them realizing the American dream of being in that top quintile age 30 in regions where there were fewer kids living in a home headed by a single mother, and they were lower in cities like Atlanta, where there were comparatively more single mothers heading families. So we go to the next slide here. So what he found in 2014 was that community family structure is, quote, the single strongest correlate of upward mobility for poor kids across the United States. What's interesting here too is it wasn't just the kids from sort of single parent families were affected by these kinds of larger community patterns. You also found that kids who were living in two-parent families were less likely to experience mobility if they grew up poor, if they were living in communities dominated by single parent families. So the larger point here is that Chetty's work with his colleagues suggests that family structure at the community level is linked to the health of the American dream at the community level. And he's since gone on to look at this issue in a more sophisticated way that would lend itself to drawing more clearly causal conclusions, and in that more recent work suggests that family structure is one of the top 5 predictors of the community factors that predict mobility for poor kids in communities across the United States. So another way of sort of saying all this is to sort of suggest that kids are more likely to realize the American dream when they grow up in a kind of a more married village or a more two-parent village. Next slide, please. Another work that I've done with Bob Lerman at the Urban Institute, suggests that the share of kids who are being raised by married parent families is linked to better economic outcomes at the state level as well. So we find that per capita growth is higher in states that have more married parents, even net of other factors like, education, race, ethnicity, et cetera, age structure. We find that child poverty is markedly lower, and family median income is markedly higher in states with more married parenthood. And again, this is controlling for other factors like race and ethnicity, education, and age structure at the state level. So our kind of bottom line conclusion, which we published in Essay in Time magazine, is that our nation's economy would be stronger, would be in better shape if more families were headed by married parents. Of course, again, the point here that we're making is that sort of family structure doesn't just matter for individual kids, it doesn't just matter for individual adults and households. It matters also for the welfare economically, among other things, of regions and communities and states across the nation. Next slide, please. So as you kind of think about core economic outcomes like child poverty, family income, and economic mobility or opportunity, all things that have been kind of on the public agenda in a major way in the last decade. The argument that I would make, that I think Wendy Wong would make, and that Robert Lerman would make, is that you should be also thinking too about kind of the health of the family, health of marriage, more particularly. Next slide, please. So I've been arguing today that think kind of about this success sequence. Obviously, that education matters, that work matters, that marriage matters for the economic well-being of young adults, their kids, and indeed their communities. So given all that, what can we do to sort of strengthen the ability of adolescents and young adults today to realize each of these three steps in the sequence? Particularly, I think, recognizing, as my slides towards the beginning of this presentation suggested, that the sequence may be more difficult for younger adults from lower income families, particularly to access or to realize. So in light of all that, a couple of suggestions to strengthen the ability of adolescents and young adults to realize the sequence. One is to recognize that even today, even in 2017, most young adults will not get a four-year college degree, and that we should be doing a lot more to strengthen vocational education and apprenticeship training so that younger adults can have access to jobs and things like advanced manufacturing, things like plumbing, things like being an electrician, et cetera, all of which pay decent wages and offer oftentimes a good measure of job stability. So that's one important point in terms of thinking about kind of strengthening our approach to education, which also has implications too for work. A second idea is to kind of expand wage subsidies for Americans who are earning below median levels of hourly income here. And I'm thinking particularly of new suggestions to detach subsidies from household structure. So kind of replace the ITC with a kind of a simple wage subsidy that would be accessible to people regardless of their marital status, regardless of their family status. And I think also would be particularly helpful in encouraging younger men who are unmarried and less educated to work or work more, which of course also have implications for their marriageability down the road. A third idea is to eliminate or minimize marriage penalties in the earned income tax credit and Medicaid and SNAP and other means-assisted programs. We have seen, for instance, in the last year, that Minnesota has enacted legislation that will give a honeymoon to lower-income couples who are receiving TANF, so that they can receive TANF even if they get married and their income goes up to a certain level without losing TANF. And so kind of expanding the idea to other programs and also to the federal government and other states. And the fourth idea here is to do more at the cultural level to articulate the value of the success sequence to younger adults, particularly the value of putting marriage before the baby carriage for younger adults. And for people who are skeptical about sort of this idea, what I would suggest we kind of recognize is we actually have achieved a lot of success when it comes to teen pregnancy, and the national campaign to prevent teen pregnancy had a great deal, I think, to do with the fact that we've seen teen pregnancy fall by more than 50% since 1990, and that we could kind of use that model to publicly articulate the value of the success sequence moving forward. Next slide, please. And I guess, yeah, you can see here these ideas articulated more clearly. Next slide, please. So if you'd like to have more information about these topics, I would encourage you to go to familystudies.org, which has posts on Monday through Thursday on family-related topics, or follow me on Twitter at Wilcox NMP. And on this webinar, you can also read the report from Wendy Wong and from me. It's handout number 1, the IFS Millennial Success Sequence final PDF, which gives you more details about the findings that Wendy and I articulated in that report that was released last year in 2017. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kay or Kathy to
Great.
answer any questions that may.
Great. Let's yeah, we'll talk about next month in a little bit. And I don't know much about this slide, but let me ask you some questions that came up, Brad. How does your research take into account, or your data take into account, asset poverty versus income poverty? I'm assuming they mean like savings accounts and assets, homes, cars, versus income coming into the family, spendable income.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually don't look at assets at all. We're looking just at income. So it's also the case too that, you know, younger adults who are coming from more affluent families are going to have more assets, more access to more assets from their parents. And so that's sort of one more way in which they're more advantaged than their peers who are coming from more asset poor families and communities. But yeah, that's a good question, one that we did not focus upon in this particular report.
So you just worked on income as opposed to assets?
Yes.
Okay. Another person wrote in, our program works with high school teen parents or high need students, at-risk students who are already technically out of the sequence. They have a child or live in poverty or live in a single parent household. So either they are a child of a single parent household or they are a parent of a single parent child household. What can be done to help those students catch up with the sequence or make up for being out of sequence without, often there's concern about shaming young adults. So what thoughts do you have on that?
No, it's a great question. I think there, my colleague Andrew Cherlin at Johns Hopkins has written about this in terms of kind of slowing things down. His basic argument is to kind of really everyone, but it also includes people who've had, you know, a child out of wedlock and are single parents right now. And his basic point is that you should think about slowing down as you go forward. And what he means by that is that, you know, both for those young adults' sakes and for the sakes of any kids that they have and might have, it'd be good for them to kind of approach the next relationship more slowly, more carefully, and to ease more slowly into commitment and and parenthood. And of course, I would add into that mix just the idea being that, either with the existing, parent of that first child to be thinking about marriage if it's a good relationship, or if it's not a great relationship or they're not particularly mature, to wait until they are ready to be committed and married before having more kids. So the point here simply is that being more deliberate and more careful about entering into relationships, not to mention becoming a parent, is good for those adults who already had a child outside of wedlock, who are already single parents, and it's good for their kids. One of the things that we're seeing in research on domestic violence is that the riskiest place for kids in America when it comes to domestic violence is in a home when you have the biological mother and an unrelated male in that household who doesn't have, a biological, a legal, or a cultural, connection to the kids in that home. And he's much more likely to be physically abusive, sexually abusive, or emotionally abusive towards those children. So I think, again, the point here is that and this is too, I think, where the Dibble Institute comes into play as well, is they're trying to give those younger adults, some tools, some education, some knowledge, some insights about relationships that will equip them to make better decisions as they go forward about their relationships and protect themselves long term, and also protect their kids.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, we get this question about, what do you do with young people, or what happened? How do you communicate with young people who have children or are at risk? And we find that when you ask them what they want for their lives, they often, not always, but they often want something different than the way they were raised. And they can still love their parents, love their mom, but they know it's tough. And so we believe that equipping them with these skills and knowledge to go slower, to make better decisions, will help, because everybody can start over and try it again. So
exactly,
okay.
I think particularly true for younger adults who are in this, new, teenage parents or 20-something parents. They're particularly at the stage where
Right.
they're going to be in new relationships down the road, one way or another. Typically, it's let's help them do that better next time.
Right. So this is a question more about cultural or system-wide income disparities, and that is, when you look at these numbers about how marriage and the success sequence is impacting millennials, and then you look at the white population, the African American population, and the Hispanic population, whites are 10 percentage points more likely to have income 7 times the poverty line anyway. So I think this is like a comment, but I guess I'm wondering, does this already structural, income disparity, as it were, how does that impact the success sequence, or does it set African American or other non-whites up for more likelihood that they'll not be following the success sequence?
Well, yeah, again, I think both class and race obviously matter in America today, as they have for many, many generations. And I'm not saying or suggesting that class doesn't matter, nor that race doesn't matter. Clearly, being raised in a low-income family or being raised African American here in America is a source of disadvantage. And one that needs to be acknowledged. But it's also important to sort of, I think, stress the idea that, if you are raised in a lower income family, or if you're African American, that your odds of of making it in America, of realizing the American dream of entering middle class or entering upper class, your odds of doing those things are much, much higher if you follow the sequence. And we all know there are plenty of African Americans and plenty of younger adults from low-income families who have done that, who followed that sequence, and realized that dream. Of course, one of the more prominent examples was our previous president and his family and their example. So the point is that I think we have to sort of recognize that when we sort of debate kind of things like social structure, class, race, and personal responsibility, it's not one or the other, it's all of the above. And what I'm suggesting in this report with Wendy Wong is that, kind of the success sequence, in particular, or personal responsibility, more general, is one ingredient, but not the only ingredient in helping not just middle class and white Americans make it in America today, but also Americans from lower income backgrounds and African American and Hispanic Americans, realize that dream today in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any plans to expand your research to non-traditional household structures like extended families, multi-generational households? These household structures are common in minority communities and also have multiple incomes that could prevent poverty. So if you're being raised by your grandparents and your aunties and your uncles and you're all in the same house, does that make a difference? Because
yeah, I don't have any plans to do that, but I would certainly acknowledge on the one hand that I think, and I'm speaking as someone who has, in-laws who are deeply involved in my kids' lives, and I'm quite appreciative of the role that extended family members can play in kids' lives and families' lives more generally. So I think both kind of financially and practically, it certainly is great when kin step in, or when kin are already integrated in important and meaningful ways into their kids' lives and their grandkids' lives. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge too that, at least in the work that Sarah McClanahan and Gary Sandifer did in their kind of seminal book in 1994 on single parenthood, they didn't find, for instance, single mothers who were living with grandmothers really, their kids really benefited from having grandmother, in the home. At least in some of the key outcomes that they were looking at, so there's something still kind of, less than ideal about, not having that two-parent, married family, in the mix. So what I'm saying, Kay, is I think that extended family can be really helpful, but my sense is that it's still the case for something, at least in the American context, it's valuable about having married parents as well in the picture.
Got it. Okay, and one last question. How do you motivate, or how would you suggest motivating teens about these outcomes, given that they don't think in the long term? They're more interested in instant gratification and subject to peer pressure and social norms. How do we communicate the success sequence?
That's a great question. I think part of the story here is about, taking this idea to educators, taking it to people who are writing music, singing music, people who are, producing, writing, directing films and TV shows, and maybe really gifted YouTube nowadays, practitioners, and basically spinning out stories, and trying to get people to sort of see different young adults, teenagers, to kind of see different narratives playing out and to depict, not in a rose-colored way, but really in a realistic way, what it looks like to put the baby carriage before marriage, and how it increases the odds that you're going to experience family drama and breakups between parents that then have implications for you as a teenager, well, as an adult down the road, and then of course for your kids, and to really stress the difficulties of not following, the long-term difficulties of not following the sequence. And so an example, of course, that I would draw upon here too is just the way in which MTV actually depicted the challenges of teen pregnancy in its series 16 and Pregnant, and to kind of take that idea and that approach and to extend it to the sequence, so it's not just about teen pregnancy, as MTV was kind of stressing in that series, but it's really about, again, the sequencing of marriage and parenthood, and that young adults who can, put marriage before the baby carriage are going to be, I'm not saying they're going to be perfect, or they're going to be experiencing bliss, but their odds of kind of forging a decent life for themselves and their kids are much higher. And we need to have our storytellers, I think, kind of depicting that reality in the pop culture and in social media, on the internet, et cetera, in ways that they're not currently often doing so today.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brad, for coming on and explaining and showing us your report on the success sequence. I think it's a really undertold story, as it were, and good to know the research and the data on that. So thank you so much. Next month, we're going to have a webinar with Emily Apt, who's the director and producer of a film called Daddy Don't Go, where she will learn about what brought them to make this documentary, what she learned. She interviewed 4 dads in Los Angeles. So it should be a really interesting follow-up on this webinar, because actually it talks a lot about family formation and what happens and how it works for people who aren't necessarily following the sequence. So please come, stay tuned for that. We'll send out an announcement tomorrow. And if you want to stay in touch with the Dibble Institute, oh, Kathy, do we have a last slide? I guess not. So Dibble Institute, dibbleinstitute.org. If you have questions, my email is kreed, all spelled out, KAYREED, @dibbleinstitute.org. If you have questions or further comments you'd like to make. But anyway, we thank you for attending, and this will be posted in the next couple of days. We'll send you an announcement about that. We'd also like you to take our little poll so you can tell us how we're doing and what we can do to improve. And with that, we wish you a very happy new year. Thanks for attending. Bye-bye.